And I think one of the things I think is important to just kind of acknowledge is that when we look at the data, when we're talking about young people, no matter where they are, and I think it's important that we look at contemporary literature, is because it always talks about the idea that not only young people are alienated or they're feeling marginalized in the communities, the societies in which they live, but I think the wider discussion about what happens when we're talking about the level of power, when we're looking at class, when we're looking at race, when we're looking at gender, and the multiple levels of discrimination that exist at all different levels, kind of reinforces some of the wider conversations around marginalization and alienation of young people. And I think when we talk about discrimination, I think it's important because it also links to some of your learning outcomes. When we're talking about discrimination, we're generally talking about the treatment of a person or a particular group of individuals in a way that ultimately is treated unfairly compared to that other group. And I think one of the things I want us to consider again is when we're talking about the levels or the multiple layers of discrimination, how does this operate socially, economically, politically in your communities? And again, I want you to think about through the lens of race, class, and gender. And one of the things that you may want to do, you know, I like to kind of throw in some theoretical ideas whilst I'm talking. You may want to look at things like critical race theory. You may want to have a discussion about critical race theory when we're talking about race, class, and gender. Because I think when we have these conversations and we're talking about social, economic, political perspectives, it's important that we understand that the levels of discrimination, the levels of the impact or the cumulative impact that discrimination has on communities at those particular three levels needs to be part of our discussion. Because one of the things that's also important, that when we're talking about the level or the notion of discrimination, we can't run away from the impact that discrimination and how that impact exists within institutions. So you heard me say things earlier on like structural racism, and how does structural racism work? And then how does structural racism operate within politics? How does structural racism impact economically? And how does structural racism, for example, impact people socially? So we may be from a particular country where the predominant numbers may be people from Black backgrounds or people of color as a whole. But does that suggest that racism is not or racism can't function because the predominant people of that particular land space may be Black? And I think these are the critical conversations that we need to have, and critical race theory will help us to have a deeper analysis on what those things are. Because then if we look at the wider context, in the first session you mentioned, or I mentioned, sorry, we were talking about the notion and the role of history. So if we know from a historical context, when we're talking about colonialism, we're talking about the impact of slavery and how the wealth of that particular time frame throughout history was utilized to build civilizations. What was taken, what was stolen, and what was the consequence of being able to build that wealth to support other civilizations. So what we understand then is that resources were taken, governments were controlled by Western governments. And then when we talk about the economic impact or the political impact or the social impact of all of the things that we see within our current society, we cannot ignore history. And one of the things that you may be aware, and one of the things that's not a coincidence, is that all of the places around the earth where you happen to find people of color, Black people specifically, are generally those particular spaces that are oftentimes the most impoverished, where we're talking about levels of high violence, we're talking about extreme and acute poverty, deprivation, high unemployment, and so on and so forth. And all I'm just suggesting here is that when we're having a conversation about discrimination, I want you to think about and consider the multiple levels on which inequality, injustice, unfairness exists within different societies, and what the ripple effect is. because we have to acknowledge the ripple effect. So I can say that here within the UK, that despite the fact that young people here in 2021 may not necessarily be involved in some of the historical things that I've just mentioned, the ripple effect of that is that we have a system, a institution, whether structurally or not, that functions on the basis of privilege, that functions on the basis of overt or covert racism that exists within law, legislation, policy, and that may impact those children and young people that may not necessarily know ultimately what's happening. So one of the things when we're talking about discrimination as well, you know, you heard me use the word racism a number of times, but one of the things that's important to understand is the bias that exists within all of our institutions, and the biases that may exist within a, not necessarily a national context, but within a global context, what that ultimately may mean. And just as a definition, you know, you like me, you know, I like to use definitions before I continue with the conversation. And all unconscious bias reflects on this idea or notion that prejudice is about the assumption or an assumption about a person or group of individual that's generally around cultural stereotypes rather than a fault for judgment. But one of the things I just want you to do, despite that we've just mentioned the definition of unconscious bias and the biases that are linked to discrimination, I want us to take a different approach. And what I mean by different approaches, I want us to be more critical about these discussions, because when we're talking about things like institutions and we're talking about structures within countries, wherever they may be, we also have to talk about the notion of power, and not just talk about prejudice and not just talk about bias, but we have to talk about the role of power, the impact of power, and how that may adversely impact particular communities. And that's why I mentioned we have to sometimes look at these issues within a global context, because I know that even if you're talking about marginalization specifically within criminal justice, that I know that I don't need to go to America, I don't need to go to the Caribbean, but I know from the UK that Black males here within the UK are 7 to 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. They're 7 to 9 times more likely to die at the hands of the state within custody. I know that they're 7 to 8 times more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act, given harsher sentences, excluded or expelled within the education system. And I can look at that from a bird's eye view in a national context within Great Britain, for example. But I only need to take my gaze and look at what's happening within America, what's happening within the Caribbean. So then we understand then when we're talking about the system dynamic, we can't ignore the ideas that I mentioned previously in the last slide, when we're talking about politics, when we're talking about the economies, you heard me say economies, and also the social impact of marginalization. Because what we're talking about is those historical contexts where we're talking about those Western governments that may utilize power and structure in order to adversely impact the lives of particular groups globally. So we have to have those conversations, and even more so because we live within a society that has privileges by default. And that doesn't mean that within your context that you may have that diversity that the UK may necessarily have. But we have to understand that we live in a society or live in societies where one group, despite whether they live there or not, when we're talking about power, control, we oftentimes find that the influence of other countries, other governments that may have on our countries is still there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be overt, but sometimes covertly driven. And it's important that when we're talking about children and young people, that they're growing up in an environment that by default, these things are subconscious, that by default, these things are not frequently discussed within the education system. It's not discussed within the household. So when we're talking about, again, the reduction or reducing alienation and marginalization, these are the things that we may start to think about then. Well, maybe there need to be more programs within education or supplementary education, meaning like the Saturday school movement, where we have organizations that come together and teach their children outside of mainstream school as an additional support, as a means to educate our children about history, about the importance of history, about the role of history, and being able to critique that in the context of where we are right now in 2021. So I'm just throwing some things out there, for one, to just get us to look at things from a different perspective. You heard me utilize the theory. Critical race theory might be something that you may want to look up as an activity to get you to think about a number of things. And then also the historical conversation that I've just mentioned, and how that may impact or get us to think about where does that fit with the definition, the conversation about discrimination, the multiple layers of discrimination, and how would that impact a child, a young person, a family that may be within your context. And again, I'm just going to utilize the point that I made earlier, that I may not necessarily need to travel to all of these different countries where, for example, Black people may be, to know that the education system, the criminal justice system, by default, systematically impacts one group over another, and get us to just think about some of the narratives, you know, from different spaces around the world and where you fit in within your context. Because when we talk about the impact of youth marginalization on communities, if you consider all of the things that we've currently mentioned within session one, and the impact of all of the things around, you know, the high unemployment, the trauma, and we look at some of the impacts on young people, the community by default, this is where I use the term you heard me mention in the first session, the ripple effect, because this is what the ripple effect is. The ripple effect on violence, the ripple effect on poor education, the ripple effect of mental health not being engaged, you know, the ripple effect of poor housing. What does that do to communities? So when you look at the level of violence, for example, I'm just using that as an example, you know, what is the impact does that have on particular communities? Where you have a generation of adults, parents, grandparents that are aggrieved, that are traumatized, that create sometimes that wall of silence because they don't want to or don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to talk about the issues that may be impacting them. And especially when there's violent individuals that may live in their communities due to that wall of silence, the police then say there's very limited things that they can do to help to sometimes catch the offenders, the perpetrators of violence, if the community don't talk. So the impact of youth marginalization on communities as it relates to violence or fatalities in the nature of shootings that I've just mentioned, we see what that can ultimately happen to parents. But then we also have communities where communities or community leaders may have businesses, may have things within that particular community that they utilized, building spaces in order to benefit those same communities. Now, you and I know that anywhere where there's business and it's doing really well, and anywhere you see crime, for example, increase, what it does to those particular businesses sometimes is it reduces the value. So then you have the ripple effect of violence, for example, in one particular community where people then don't want to spend their money. People don't then want to come to those particular businesses out of fear because they may feel that it's not a good investment, for example. And then we start to see the further ripple effect, because then you have a number of buildings that should have been used for investment, where people could have been pumping finance to enable those communities to have revenue, for those communities to build and make something for themselves, that due to that finance being disconnected because of the belief and the idea that those areas may be considered hotspot areas for violence, for example, that wealth is removed, dismantled, taken away, then those businesses struggle to stay alive. And then when you look within impoverished and some of the most acute areas of poverty in different societies, you have loads of abandoned buildings, And oftentimes, what are they used for? Crack houses, places of which where individuals can utilize to either sell drugs to other individuals, or individuals can utilize those spaces in order to take the drugs. But what does that do in the ripple effect again? It decreases the value of that community. And again, I'm going to go back to my previous point. When we start to use a bird's eye lens, where are all the communities that get impacted the most? What communities get impacted the most? When we're talking about communities being devalued on the position of economic marginalization, what communities are impacted the most? And then what do we see? More and more violence, because then we start to see people saying they don't have. Again, those multinational corporations are still marketing, are still advertising all of the things that people should have. Buy. But then you have communities that are struggling. There's no investment into those particular communities. All they're waiting for is government aid. And as a consequence of that government aid also being quite limited, people are making very risky decisions and making really bad, poor life choices in order to survive. So when we talk about the impact or the ripple effect, I prefer to use the term, the ripple effect on communities is vast. There is not one, but it's important to understand that it's almost like a domino effect. And that's why I like the ripple, because it becomes multiple. Where it starts in one place, it ends up somewhere else. So I utilize violence as an example. But in areas where there's high levels of violence, you also find a high level of unemployment. You notice that the education's poor in those areas. You notice that the housing conditions of the people are not great. And a few buildings and a few businesses that exist, what type of businesses are they? Food, what type of food? Is it food for health or is it fast food? And these are the questions and conversations that we need to be having in particular communities. And again, I'm not suggesting that all of our respected organizations and the professional status that we hold, we are going to be able to engage with all of those things. But going back to my point that I made in session number 1, what are we able to do great? What are the skills and the qualities and the competencies that we have that we can achieve, that we can respond to one of those issues? And again, think about some of the things that I'm saying within your context and how does that impact? Because the wider discussion that we need to be having now, you've heard me use the word community and the impact of community and the ripple effect, the domino effect on all of the impacts. The wider question needs to be, do our young people feel part of the community in the first place? What is community? Maybe needs to be a point of discussion too. What does community mean to you? What does community mean to us? But most importantly, what does community mean to children and young people that live there? Because if young people don't feel part of the community, we then can start to understand that another level of why we see the things that we are struggling and fighting to eradicate, to reduce. And there's one African proverb that states this, and I love this proverb, that says, if children do not feel part of the village, they will burn it down to feel its warmth. I'll say it again. If children do not feel part of the village, they will burn it down to feel its warmth. So when we talk about community, when we talk about the role of community, and we talk about us, and this is where, again, I use the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the first session. We were talking about the needs of children and young people. Are their needs being met? Are their physiological needs being met? The children have money in their pockets. Can they feed themselves? Are their safety needs being met? Do they have safety? Do they feel safe? Do they feel secure in their communities? Are their needs about love and belonging being met? Having a vision, their aspirations, that they get to a point where they understand their purpose and they're able to reach for the stars? Are their needs being met? And these are the conversations that we need to have, because it's adults and institutions and organizations, going back to social disorganization or organization again, they govern those particular communities. So if young people using Maslow's hierarchy of needs, their needs are ultimately not being met, then who's going to fulfill those needs? The drug dealers, the extremists, the pimps, social media, and they're going to find individuals with a completely negative mindset that are going to fulfill those needs, because they recognize that they live in a capitalist society too. They recognize that they don't have no money in their pocket, and they're going to present to them a series of ideas and strategies and ways that they can make that money, that they can achieve and meet their needs that's not being met by us within the society. So I think that's also a critical discussion as well, when we think about the idea of community and where young people see themselves within the community, because we utilize this term, quite flippantly. We use the word community, but what does it mean? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to us? And most importantly, what does it mean to the young people? Because when we're talking about the breakdown in community, this is what we're talking about. And that's what session 1 was all about, when we were talking about some of the theoretical ideas that you can use to explain why young people feel marginalized in their particular communities. And this is kind of the crux of what this unit is ultimately all about. We recognize and acknowledge that there is a breakdown within our communities, our societies, and we know the process of marginalization now. We know the effects of marginalization because of the breakdown, and now we experience and understand and now can make sense of the ripple effect, and whether that ripple effect may devalue communities, where that ripple effect may cause more violence, where that ripple effect makes people want to move out, and also those that are gifted, talented, educated, feel that they don't want to be in that particular community no more, and they leave the community. So the knowledge base, the economics, the political minds within particular communities run for the hills because they don't want to be in that environment. And then you've just got a community that is broken. So we can't utilize these terms, community, because sometimes we have communities within communities. I work with young people that are, within, for example, the Christian community, but those young people don't feel part of the Christian community, but they go to church damn near every day. So it's important that we have these understandings and conversations to make better understandings, or better make sense, of what it means to be within a community amongst young people. And there's a few more theoretical ideas that we can use. Some of them we've discussed already, so you know what social disorganization means. But one of the things you also can look at is strain theory. And I think where you can look at Merton's strain theory is this, and one of the things you may be interested in, this is rooted within criminological text. And all strain theory kind of talks about is this idea that you have communities that are oftentimes narrated by the dominant members of society, the dream. And this is rooted in the Chicago School of Thought. And what Merton was looking at within his research ultimately was looking at the American dream. And he was saying that the American dream that was oftentimes projected within film, within our media channels, within the education system, that as long as you go to education, as long as you go to school, as long as you get a job, you're going to live this particular type of way. And what he recognized was that there were some communities that were living in environments where the education was poor and unemployment was high. So the narrative of the American dream didn't fit with the groups of individuals that lived within those impoverished communities. And as a consequence of that, we've seen those communities doing things in order to live that American dream because they wanted the nice things that the American dream ultimately projected. And we talk about violence, we talk about drug selling and so on and so forth, and what happens with that. So we can look at strain theory in the context of our communities. So not only our organizations or communities in which we operate from, so not only the communities where young people live are socially disorganized, there's also a level of strain, because those young people, whilst feeling alienated and marginalized, are feeling I can't achieve all of the things that are ultimately out there. And if we look at the cycle again, we can utilize these two theories as an example to explain. So they feel alienated and marginalized in a community that's socially disorganized. They're trying to navigate their way within that community or within that society. There's a level of strain that they want to get rid of because they believe that they can't achieve the things in that particular community or society, and they make a series of choices. So then we can look at differential association, which we looked at in session 1, and they join those particular deviant groups with the idea that they want to have their needs met. Again, Maslow's hierarchy needs. So we've just mentioned 4 theories within that cycle. They have this belief that it is the only way that they're going to achieve the material goods, to achieve the idea of significance, credibility, visibility within their communities. And again, we can use self-fulfilling prophecies, invisibility syndrome here. So what I'm doing in a nutshell, I just made that kind of in a way that was a little bit exciting for us. But one of the things I want us to think about is that when we're having these conversations, that we can use a number of theories to ground our argument, to ground what it is that we're talking about. Now, you don't have to necessarily use these theories, because there may be theories that you can think of or you're aware of that you think fit much better within your context. And I'm happy for you to do that. But I'm just throwing a few out there that will get us to kind of think about some of the fundamentals. So when I'm doing a lot of my work, I utilize strain theory quite a lot to explain. I utilize self-fulfilling prophecies and Merton's notion of self-fulfilling prophecies. I talk a lot about what young people do when they feel invisible, they feel unseen, they feel unheard. And if they live within that village and they don't feel part of that village, they don't feel part of that community, what are they ultimately prepared to do in order to feel its warmth? And those are the conversations that we need to be having as it relates to utilizing theoretical ideas to kind of enhance our understanding and our explanation of why children and young people feel marginalized, the process of that marginalization, the impact of that marginalization, the ripple effect of what that may be, and how that ultimately impacts the ideas around reduction, reducing, and thinking of ways that we can ultimately either eradicate or reduce some of the issues that young people are ultimately faced. And then we can look at another theoretical idea. You know, some of you are familiar with the 5 Faces of Oppression by Jung. And again, what I just want you to just kind of just be familiar with is just a number of theoretical ideas that we can use in order to explain that. And within Jung's work, you know, the notion of the 5 Faces of Oppression kind of sits on 5 principles or in 5 categories. And it's explained that the role of oppression operates at different levels. And there's a lot of critiques, I must say, around this particular theory. But I think that the brilliant thing about theoretical ideas is that we can use, we can adapt, and we can change. And that's why when I go back to my previous slide, I'm suggesting that within your context, some of these may fit and some of them may not. Why? Because geographically things are different. When we're talking about gender, when we're talking about race, when we're talking about class, when we're talking about ability, we're talking about disabilities, we're talking about sexual orientation. With all of those things that I just ultimately mentioned, it's important to acknowledge that some theories apply and some things don't apply. But again, some of the things that ones that I just mentioned around your strain theory, your invisibility syndrome, your differential association, I utilize those when I'm engaging with young people to have a better understanding of why they make some of their decisions. And just in the same type of way, Jung's 5 Faces of Oppression is explained in a similar nature. You know, the fact that communities are exploited, and as a consequence of that exploitation, it is a level of oppression. And from that, and as a consequence of that, you see young people feel a particular type of way, or the communities feel a certain type of way. And I think one of the things I think is important as well, and I'll just use this as an example, I'm going to try and use as many examples as possible to kind of explain this, is that when you talk about exploitation of particular communities, one of the things here within the UK is that some Black communities feel that they're always exploited by the media. You know, the media want to come into their communities and they're very interested in their stories around raising some of the awareness of the issues that may exist within Black communities, for example. But the only narrative that they want to learn or hear about is about violence, is about selling drugs. So the communities feel that the narrative that is being projected, even though the media may want to learn, is that the communities feel quite exploited on those particular narratives, because then those narratives go out in film and documentaries, and what that does as the ripple effect is it makes the wider audience that may come from different groups perceive and assume that when we're talking about violence within the UK, it's only this one group of people. And when we're talking about drug dealing, for example, it's only one group of people. But then think about the impact that has on other communities. And let's think about the impact that has on the community that's been exploited for their stories, and it's been projected then out into the mass media. And then those particular groups feel quite hostile. They feel oppressed, because then the decision making, that's going back to the points I made earlier about discrimination and inequality, and when we're talking about equity and we're talking about fairness, then you have agencies and organizations that by default, subconsciously are mistreating those particular groups because they have a perception of them based on what's covered within the media. So we can look at 5 faces of oppression through the lens of exploitation, and that's the fundamental question. How are people being exploited? How are those communities being exploited? And that's just one way of oppression. What happens within those particular communities where individuals with finance know people are poor, and they utilize finance in those particular spaces within the community to ensure that their needs are ultimately being met? So when we look at things like prostitution, when we look at things like human trafficking, when we look at things like young children being used to sell drugs, who's being exploited? The children from those impoverished communities. But who's benefiting? Those individuals that are in maybe a different class or in a position of power to be able to exploit those particular groups. And then when we look at things like marginalisation, we've already covered that throughout this whole module, so you understand what oppression may mean for those individuals that feel that. But then we talk about the impact of powerlessness in the 3rd category of Young's explanation of the 5 faces of oppression. That when we talk about particular communities within your context or within my context, we can agree that those communities or those groups of individuals specifically within the communities feel powerless. Let's think about some of the points that I just made earlier about the statistics as it relates to criminal justice, as it relates to education, as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to mental health services, for example. And we know that there is a disparity between one group within our country versus another group, because one group has privilege by default, and through to that privilege of being chosen, being catered for first, you have those that don't come from the predominant group or the dominant group that feel quite powerless. So when things happen to that group, they have no rights, they have no political status, they have no economic status. And think about all of the things that I've just mentioned, socially, politically, economically, and they have no strong grounding within their community because of all of the other things that I've just mentioned, and feel quite powerless. So when we then talk about the other category, which he mentions about cultural imperialism, it's that notion again about power, dominant groups. And those dominant groups that by default, and when we talk about systemic issues that exist within, I say, the DNA of particular Western civilizations, those institutions and organizations that by default sometimes reinforce that imperialism, that dominance. And that doesn't necessarily have to be overtly in the way that people speak to people, but we just look at the whole industries within the media, within film, who is put and perceived as the best, who is perceived as the most beautiful, who is projected as the most intelligent. And I'm going to go back to my point again about history, that I don't need to travel to all of the countries around the world to know that there is a difference when we talk about the power structures between one group over another. And when we talk about the exploitation, the marginalization, the powerlessness of particular groups within wider society, generally poor, impoverished people that come from particular racial backgrounds, the conversation makes perfect sense. And in those communities, when we talk about that dominance that exists within different communities, oftentimes that's governed by violence. It's oftentimes governed by violence. And it's interesting because I'll give an example. Last year when we seen the Black Lives Matter movement, I remember a young person being questioned by a journalist, I believe it was America. And the question was, why are you young people, engaging in violence? Why are you young people engaging in this type of behavior? And I think his response was really interesting. It definitely got me thinking, and definitely got those of us that witnessed and listened to that interview. And he says, why is it that we, meaning young Black males, are the only ones or the only group across the globe that are not allowed to use violence when they just want equality, freedom, and justice? He said every other nation, talking about that cultural imperialism again, every other nation utilizes violence to get their points across, to get their laws changed, to get anything they want, desire within the world. And we're talking about the pulling of resources and the building of wealth and industries and civilizations as a whole. But he said, we as young Black people are never allowed to use violence. We're just supposed to take the violence. We're supposed to just lie down and surrender. We're supposed to remain powerless, feel alienated and marginalized. And everybody uses that violence towards us. Yet the moment we utilize violence, it's a big global problem. And it really got me to think about the conversation we're having here about the 5 faces of oppression. And again, these are conversations that I want us to think about and consider why we see some of the behaviors that exist within particular communities. And goes back to what we said in session 1 about the joining and the creation of subgroups. Why do groups of young people create subgroups within the first place? Maybe because they don't feel part of the community. Maybe they don't feel part of the wider system that utilizes this word flippantly about community. And maybe they join and create these groups, these subgroups, as a means for survival, as a means for protection, as a means to take care of each other. But then when the vices, the cultural imperialism, the exploitation of the dominant group, for example, start to then feed in to those things socially, economically, politically, we then start to see sometimes those groups turn away from the protection, the helping each other, the survival into other means. And it's interesting that we can look at this from a historical context of throughout the world, that a lot of community spaces where you had oppression, where you had people feeling that they were fighting for their freedom, justice, equality, to be treated fairly, that those groups were always targeted with that cultural imperialism, were targeted, and vices were given to those particular communities. So there is no coincidence that where we look around the world, where you had community leaders, community activists, you had strong community vision around how do they reduce marginalization within their communities. And now we have those same communities that are involved in violent activity, drug selling, destroying their own community. So these are things I just want us to think about as the adverse impact. And I think the 5 faces of oppression enable us to ultimately do that. So we've come to the end of the session. I hope that for this particular unit, I'll give you some real broad context and ideas about marginalization, thinking about the process of how young people are marginalized, to think about the impact, the effects of marginalization, to also think about where that fits when we're talking about the ripple effect that exists within communities, to think about some of the principles when we're talking about fairness, equality. You heard me use the word humanity in the last session, and most importantly, thinking about or knowing ways of reducing that marginalization alien amongst our young people. So thank you for engaging in this session. My name is Craig Pinkney, and I'll see you all soon.